So lucky me, I get to start with some stats. At the moment, we've even seen a lot of growth since these stats were done, but self-managed super funds now represent almost 33% of the total superannuation industry in Australia. There's almost 1 million Australians running their own self-managed super funds, and the growth has just been phenomenal. So what I really want to talk to you about is the reasons why. What are the benefits? Why have I set up my own super fund? And basically all the opportunities that come with running your own fund. So self-managed super funds, yes, all super funds are tax structured, and self-managed super funds are no different. So really it's no different than setting up a company or a trust to run your other affairs. You're taking control by setting up a structure, getting your superannuation into that structure, and then you have full control over the investments that are made by your own self-managed super fund. So what I find quite common, and you referenced to it before, is the letter that comes in the mail, you know, every 6 months or something, and that's about most people's whole experience with superannuation. And you might look at the return, or you might not look at anything at all. Self-managed super funds are really a way of taking an interest and getting regular reports and really having the freedom to take control of how your superannuation grows in the future. So they're funds that you manage. You are the trustees of your fund. And you make all the decisions essentially. So they're the fastest growing sector in the superannuation industry in Australia, and ultimately you are running your fund for the benefit of your retirement. So who better to look after the decisions around your super than you, really? So here's some of the stats. We now have, I think it's close to 500,000 self-managed super funds now in Australia, which is a 67% increase in just 7 years. So that's a huge amount of growth. And but what I really want to talk about is, other than these stats, is why. Greater control is probably the most common reason. As I said, basically, as a trustee of your self-managed super fund, you're making all the decisions. So you decide where that money is invested, rather than having a board of trustees doing that for you. And it has great flexibility as well, because you're able to make decisions much more quickly than some of those boards would be able to, who have the interests of a large pool of members basically that they're looking after. So you're looking after your own interests. You can choose what you invest in. There are a lot of rules and responsibilities around that, and it's my job to help you as your auditor to understand those limitations and the rules that you have to abide by. But essentially that's what the professionals are there for, and that's what Moneywise is there for, is to help you know what you can and can't invest in, but what you do need to know is that there's a great flexibility. So what we're going to be talking a bit about tonight is property, and that's an asset class that really is difficult to have much involvement in when you're dealing with a retail fund or an industry fund. There's a lot of opportunities around borrowing and investing in commercial property and rentals and things like that in self-managed super funds that otherwise wouldn't be available. Some of the other advantages, other than flexibility and control, we've got full knowledge of investments held. So because you are making the investment decisions, you do know where your money's invested. So does everyone know where their money's invested in their superannuation right now? No? Should you know? Yeah, probably. So when you're on your own fund, you've made the decisions to invest there. You make the choice as to how much advice you get when you're doing that, but you get a consistent annual reporting system as well that backs you up to tell you how those investments are performing and any rebalances or any things that you should do to put yourself in the best position. Cost savings, so potentially, depending on how much money you have in super, self-managed super funds can be cheaper to run, especially if you're one of those many people that have lots of superannuation accounts all over the place. So if you're going to be coming straight in with 10 different super funds and you're paying fees and insurance in all of them, combine that, I mean, just the consolidation, whether you do that in a non-SMSF or you do it in an SMSF, is automatically going to save you money most likely. And there's tax advantages as well. So there's tax advantages for all superannuation funds, but self-managed super funds, because they are so flexible, you have usually more choice over starting pensions and stopping pensions, and a lot of strategies that are available to self-managed super funds that aren't always available outside. So they're a great tax planning vehicle because we've got a lot more we can do inside them that aren't always available when you're in an industry fund that sets its own rules and decides what products they will offer you and what they won't, if you know what I mean. So with self-managed super funds, you get the maximum advantages available to superannuation because you're the trustees, you decide whether to offer that to yourself. Okay, some other advantages: combining spousal super to achieve a greater total. So I talked about that in my family, that we did that, not only with a spouse, but I also brought my parents in. Ideally, it's not the best to have your children and parents in the same fund, but it can be good in certain circumstances. And what we'll eventually do is when my parents have enough, they'll go and set up their own fund and we'll have a better separation. That's important for estate planning and just making sure that there's fairness between children and things like that, you know, really. But that's not to say that it can't work like it did in my situation. You can transfer existing commercial investments to free up cash. So if you have commercial property outside at the moment, if you own it in your business, if you own it in a trust, or just in your own personal name, you can actually get that into your self-managed super fund, and that's where it should be. So if there is anyone that owns commercial property outside self-managed super, as a small business owner or anything, and you're thinking, that's my super, it's no good being outside. It's no good having super outside super. And quite often I hear that, especially small business people, they'll say, oh, that house is my super, or that business premises is my super. But it's actually not in a super environment, and so therefore it really is it's just an investment that you're calling that, but you're not getting all the great tax advantages that come with super, and it doesn't have the same protection as super as well. So some of those, I may as well talk about quickly. Assets inside super are protected from bankruptcy, for example. Assets outside are not. So that's a significant advantage, especially with commercial property, is to have that fully protected inside your super fund. But it may also apply for things like listed shares. If you've got them in your personal name, you can also transfer those into your self-managed super fund. So you don't necessarily need to look at the investments you've got at the moment and keep them outside. You could look and think it's one or the other. There are strategies to combine the two and have those investments where you don't have to dispose of them, you just sell them into your self-managed super fund. But there are restrictions, and the most important one, which Brett loves because he gets asked all the time, is residential properties. So if you do have residential rental properties outside, we can't get them in, unfortunately. So creditor protection, that's what I was just referring to, the fact that money inside and your assets inside a self-managed super fund are protected. And one of the worst things I see from an audit perspective is people who start getting a bit of cash flow problems in their business, and they run their own self-managed super fund, they've got both checkbooks there, and they start, you know, dipping into their superannuation because they're trying to keep creditors at bay, they're trying to keep their business afloat, and the financial pressures are sort of causing this temptation to start dipping into their super. And that's the worst thing you can do, because usually what happens in that situation, they take a little bit, they take a little bit more, and then suddenly they take a lot more. and then you end up in a situation where you're looking at these clients and they've got nothing. And if they it hasn't saved the business because it was going to go anyway, and if they just left it where it was, at least the business is gone, it was always going to go, but at least they would have had this pot sitting there to look after them one day. And then, yeah, I mean, they end up in a situation where it's not protected anymore. So when you do set up a self-managed super fund, always look at it as this is my retirement. It's got nothing to do with my business. There are legal ways, like commercial property, for example, that it may have some advantage to your business now, but please don't ever look at superannuation as having any ability to, you know, deal with those financial situations, because, it's just dangerous, effectively. Estate planning, so it's really good when you're setting up a self-managed super fund to also review your wills and make sure that you've got good, strong death benefit nominations in place, and that you're really thinking about the whole life of your super fund. So I always talk about, if you're getting advice on superannuation and particular investments, get advice about the whole life cycle of it, and that's the same for your self-managed super fund. Like, what happens when I die at this age or that age? What happens if my partner dies? What do I get? And how does that... It's important to understand those estate planning things and plan for it, because you just never know when that's going to happen. Part of that is insurance as well, is making sure that you're getting good advice when you set up your fund to have the right insurance in the right place as well. Insurance might be best in your self-managed super fund, but the insurance might also be best somewhere else. It might be best in another superannuation fund, for example, because it might be cheaper. And visibility is another advantage. So disadvantages, it can be more expensive as well. So if you're starting off with a smaller balance, or if you're going to be trading very frequently, your self-managed super fund can potentially be more expensive. But again, it's this cost-benefit thing, like how much is it worth to you to have control over your super, have the flexibility to get into investment opportunities. Obligations of trustees is down as disadvantage. I just think it's, you know, with reward comes responsibility, really. So I don't think it's really a disadvantage as long as you ask before you do. So that's probably the greatest advice I can have. But as a trustee of your fund, you are responsible for your decisions. So if you do the wrong thing, you can expect to be penalised for that, and can expect that you're the one that's going to lose out, and you're not going to be able to go to anyone else and demand your money back or anything like that if you're the one that's made the decisions that's resulted in you being penalised. There is a lot of paperwork, but that can be dealt with as well. But you do have to expect a larger amount of paperwork and a lot more signing of things, because you are making the investment decisions. So you're signing up to buy investments and things like that. It is. You know, I know people who run their self-managed super fund in their retirement as their job. So it can be quite, you know, there can be quite a lot involved, and you have to be willing to take on that responsibility. And also your experience in running a fund. So just as you might look at the statement and think, oh, I can do better than that, maybe you can, maybe you can't. Depends on the advice you have, what experience you have. You might know particular investment classes really well and you're really comfortable with that, or you might need to rely more heavily on advice. So if you're not used to making investment decisions, just make sure you've got the advisors in place that you trust, that you're able to get that help, and don't go off, you know, trying to do it all yourself. It's a self-managed super fund, but that doesn't mean that you can't get professional advice. Other considerations. So one of the things here, contribution limits. We talked about transferring assets into a self-managed super fund, but anytime you're making contributions to any fund, contribution limits apply. So if you're going to be transferring large assets or large amounts of cash into a superannuation fund, always get advice first, because the tax can be up to, I think it's 93% or something crazy if you get it wrong. So I mean, that wouldn't happen to the majority of people, but if these are the contribution limits, 25,000, this is per annum. If you're under 50, and if you're over 50, it's 50,000. That's for deductible contributions, so that's either salary sacrifice, employer contributions, or any contributions you're getting a deduction for. Otherwise, you can make, as well, in addition to that, 150,000 of contributions from your personal money, which can be brought forward 3 years. So you could put 450,000 in individually in a year, and then you don't have any limit for the next 2 years on that 150. So I mentioned insurance, with insurance, the main thing when you're setting up a self-managed super fund is to make sure that you don't cancel policies without replacing them, or that you get proper insurance advice to make sure which is the best place to have your insurance. Because you might have really good insurance policies attached to your existing super, and there's nothing worse than winding it all up and closing it down, setting up your self-managed super fund, and then having no insurance and not realising and something happens, or going to get a new policy and finding out it's mega expensive and that no one will insure you because you're in a different position. Or like that happened to my dad as well. When we set up our fund, he had an old A&P policy, and he has a lot of health problems, so I couldn't get him insurance in our self-managed super fund. Like, it just wasn't going to happen. But thankfully we'd left his old A&P policy open and he was able to continue that insurance outside. So he just contributes a little bit to that every year to top up his policy. So particularly if you've got health problems or you've been insured for years and maybe have discounts applying and things like that, it's just something to think about. It does take a bit of time to set up a self-managed super fund, and so we're going to be talking about the strategies around borrowing in particular. It's very important that you don't go off and get really excited about finding an awesome property and like doing all the borrowing and everything and then try and set up your self-managed super fund. The first thing you do is go and set up your self-managed super fund, get all that advice, do your rollovers, you get the money in, and then you get excited. Expenses while setting up, so there are setup costs involved. The sole purpose test you need to think about. So that's what I was talking about your superannuation is there for your retirement. So you can't have holiday houses, you can't lend money to yourself. I mean, really, you need to be running it with the intention that it's there for, and that is for retirement. And yeah, as I said, can't transfer residential property, unfortunately. But a super fund can hold residential property. It just can't buy it from you, and it can't rent it to you or your relatives.